The moment is always small, almost invisible unless you know where to look. It isn't a confession, a touch, or even a smile meant for the camera. It's a shift in posture, a pause that lasts half a second too long, a softness that replaces control without warning. That is what people mean when they say he melts, not romance on display, but composure quietly giving way. For Jamie Dornan, image discipline has long been second nature. Years in the public eye trained him to regulate expression, tone, and reaction with precision. Yet there has been one consistent exception that keeps slipping through those defenses. Whenever Dakota Johnson looks at him in unscripted moments, something changes. Melt is not a flattering exaggeration, it's a psychological description. It refers to a brief lowering of emotional armor, when self-monitoring drops and instinct takes over. In high-pressure public settings, that kind of reaction is rare. When it happens repeatedly in response to the same person, it becomes noticeable. What makes these moments compelling is that they rarely occur during performances. On set, everything is intentional and rehearsed. The reactions people focus on tend to happen in interviews, panel discussions, or transitions between questions. These are spaces where performers relax just enough for instinct to surface. Observers have noted how his expressions soften when Dakota makes eye contact, even briefly. His shoulders drop, his voice shifts, and his attention narrows. It's not dramatic, but it's consistent. Consistency is what transforms coincidence into pattern. Crucially, this reaction does not appear with others. Jamie is known for being warm and engaging, yet his composure generally remains intact. With Dakota, that balance tilts. The difference is subtle, but subtlety is exactly where involuntary emotion lives. Fans began cataloging these moments long before the phrase, melts every time, caught on. Clips from different years, locations, and contexts showed the same reflex repeating itself. When patterns survive time and circumstance, they tend to reveal something internal rather than situational. That endurance is what drew attention. Psychologically, eye contact can act as a powerful trigger. It bypasses language and taps directly into emotional memory. When two people share unresolved emotional history, even a glance can reactivate it. The body responds faster than the mind can intervene. What makes this dynamic especially striking is how quickly Jamie regains control. The melt is brief, almost immediately followed by composure snapping back into place. That recovery suggests awareness, as if he recognizes the slip and corrects it. Control returning so fast implies that it momentarily left. Industry insiders often say that genuine reactions are hardest to fake and hardest to suppress. You can rehearse lines and gestures, but reflexes emerge before intention. That's why these moments resonate so strongly with viewers. They don't look performed. Another telling detail is how Jamie tends to redirect himself afterward. He may adjust posture, change tone, or refocus on the interviewer. These micro-corrections are signs of self-regulation kicking in. They reinforce the idea that the reaction was unplanned. Dakota's role in these moments is passive rather than performative. She doesn't reach out or exaggerate expression. Often, she simply looks at him while listening. That normalcy makes the response more striking. It suggests the trigger isn't her behavior, but what she represents emotionally. The repetition of this dynamic over time is what elevated it from curiosity to narrative. If it happened once, it would be forgettable. Happening again and again, across years, suggests emotional continuity. Continuity is difficult to dismiss. Some argue that this is simply chemistry, a leftover habit from working closely together. Yet chemistry usually fades when circumstances change. This reaction hasn't. It appears disconnected from context and resistant to time, which is why it's read as something deeper. What unsettles observers most is not the intensity, but the lack of escalation. There is no follow-up action, no public acknowledgement, no progression. The emotion surfaces and is immediately contained. That containment hints at something that exists but is actively managed. By the end of this first layer, the story isn't about romance or scandal. It's about reflex, about what happens when control momentarily fails. Jamie doesn't melt because he chooses to, but because some reactions cannot be fully governed. That is what makes these moments linger in the public imagination. They feel unedited, unscripted, and therefore trustworthy. In a world where almost everything is curated, a split second of genuine reaction can feel louder than any declaration. And once people notice it, they can't stop seeing it. Once those moments were noticed, they stopped being isolated observations and became part of a larger emotional narrative. Viewers no longer watched individual clips in a vacuum, they watched them in sequence. Each glance, each softened expression, was measured against the last. What emerged was not escalation, but persistence, and persistence is often more revealing than intensity. For Jamie Dornan, that persistence created a new kind of exposure. He wasn't revealing anything deliberately, yet his reactions were doing quiet work on his behalf. The more he attempted to maintain distance and professionalism, the more striking those brief lapses became. Control, paradoxically, made the loss of control easier to see. The danger of nonverbal signals is that they resist explanation. Words can be clarified, walked back, or contextualized. A look cannot. When audiences believe they are witnessing something involuntary, trust shifts from official narratives to instinctive interpretation. That shift is why these moments carried so much weight. What complicated matters further was how consistently Dakota Johnson appeared unaffected by the scrutiny. She did not exaggerate her reactions or attempt to mirror his. Often, she remained neutral, attentive, even relaxed. That asymmetry intensified the narrative, because it placed the emotional movement almost entirely on one side. Psychologically, this imbalance matters. When one person reacts more visibly to a stimulus than the other, observers infer unreciprocated intensity or unresolved feeling. Whether accurate or not, that perception is powerful. It turns small moments into emotional evidence. As the narrative grew, fans began to describe the looks as slips, moments where long-maintained barriers briefly fell. These weren't read as confessions, but as failures of suppression. The idea that something had to be suppressed in the first place became the story. Suppression implies presence. Attempts to counter this perception through distance only partially worked. Fewer shared appearances reduced opportunities for scrutiny, but they also heightened anticipation. When interaction finally occurred, audiences watched more closely than ever. Reduced frequency increased impact. Industry observers note that once a nonverbal pattern is established, it's almost impossible to undo. Even neutral behavior can be interpreted through that lens. A glance becomes loaded, a smile becomes suspicious, and restraint becomes evidence of effort. The narrative sustains itself. This created a feedback loop. The more Jamie tried to regulate his reactions, the more attention was paid to regulation itself. Emotional neutrality began to look unnatural, while brief warmth looked explosive. In that environment, no response felt safe. The emotional cost of such scrutiny is rarely visible, but it is real. Living under constant interpretation forces hyper-awareness. Every movement must be considered, every interaction filtered. Over time, that vigilance can drain spontaneity and authenticity, even outside the public eye. For audiences, however, this tension was compelling. It suggested depth without disclosure, emotion without declaration. The lack of resolution made the story durable. Unlike scandals that peak and collapse, this narrative lingered because it offered no endpoint. Crucially, none of this required confirmation of a relationship. The story survived on reaction alone. That is the power of nonverbal communication in celebrity culture. It bypasses official messaging and appeals directly to intuition. What many found unsettling was how human the reaction appeared. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic display, just a brief softening that anyone might experience around someone meaningful. That familiarity made it relatable, and relatability invites belief. As time passed, the phrase, "melts every time," became shorthand for something more complex. It no longer meant obvious affection, but involuntary emotional recognition. Recognition of shared history, unresolved feeling, or simply deep familiarity. The exact nature mattered less than the consistency. In the end, The narrative didn't frame Jamie as careless or reckless. It framed him as human, someone whose emotional reflexes occasionally outran his defenses. In an industry built on performance, those moments stood out precisely because they didn't look performed.